The lamp was still burning. Fannie Covington saw it from half a mile out, a single warm eye glowing amber against the vast black curtain of the Montana night, and something cracked open inside her chest so violently she had to pull her mare to a stop and press her fist against her sternum just to keep breathing. She had been gone 11 days. 11 days riding through the Bitterroot Range with her father's cattle ledgers in her saddlebag, and her father's debts coiled around her throat like a hangman's rope, negotiating, bargaining, and at times outright begging men in Billings who smelled of whiskey and contempt. 11 days sleeping on hard ground and in worse tavern beds, eating jerked beef and thinking about that lamp, thinking about whether it would still be there when she got back. It was. It was always there. And that was the problem that had finally cracked her open tonight, because Roscoe Barnett was not supposed to mean this much to her. He was her ranch foreman. He worked her land. He broke her horses and mended her fences and argued with her about crop rotation, with an intensity that made her want to either kiss him or fire him. And she had never in her 26 years of life been so confused about which impulse was the right one to follow. She sat on her mare in the dark, the October wind cutting through her trail coat, staring at that lamp, and she finally admitted to herself the truth she had been running from for the better part of 2 years. She was desperately, irreversibly, terrifyingly in love with Roscoe Barnett. And she had no earthly idea what to do about it, because the last time she had trusted a man with her heart, he had used it as currency to pay off a gambling debt, and the wreckage of that betrayal had nearly taken the whole Covington ranch down with it. She clicked her heels against her mare's flanks and rode toward the light. The story of Fannie Covington and Roscoe Barnett began the way most important things begin in Montana Territory in the year 1883, which is to say it began badly, in the middle of a catastrophe, with both parties convinced the other one was going to be the death of them. Fannie's father, Clement Covington, had built the Double C Ranch from nothing over 30 years, turning a quarter section of scrubgrass territory into one of the finest cattle operations between Helena and the Wyoming border. He had done it with stubbornness and cleverness and the kind of relentless physical labor that eventually took his knees, then his hips, and finally, in the spring of 1882, his heart. He died in March, leaving Fannie the ranch, 4,000 acres of mixed grazing land, approximately 200 head of cattle, a mountain of debt she had not known existed, and a foreman who had given notice the very week Clement passed, citing instability in the operation's finances. Fannie was left with 4 ranch hands, a cook named Delia who was 70 years old and mean as a cornered badger, and the creeping, nauseating certainty that she was going to lose everything her father had built. She had placed an advertisement in the Helena Independent in April, seeking an experienced ranch foreman, and had received exactly 3 responses. 2 of them were from men who made it abundantly clear in their letters that they believed the real solution to Fannie's problem was not a competent foreman, but a husband who could take the operation off her hands. She had burned those letters with considerable satisfaction. The 3rd letter was from Roscoe Barnett of Deer Lodge, and it was unlike any letter she had ever received in her life. It was not flowery. It did not compliment her or make any observations about her situation being difficult for a woman alone. It was 4 sentences long. It read, "I have 14 years of cattle ranching experience in Montana Territory and Colorado. I know beef prices, grass management, water rights, and men. I do not drink on the job, and I am not afraid of hard work. If you want to see my references, I can be in Larkspur Crossing by the 20th. Fannie had read it 3 times. Then she had written back and told him to come. He arrived on the 20th, which impressed her immediately. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had been recently cut and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same granite as the mountains. He was wearing a clean shirt, which she also noticed, because it suggested he had made an effort without making a performance of it. He shook her hand when they met, which not every man did with women, and he looked her directly in the eye when he spoke, which even fewer men did. He spent that first day walking every inch of the double C, asking questions about water sources, grazing rotation, the condition of the eastern fence line, the age and health of the breeding stock. He talked to her four hands individually and at length. He inspected the barn, the hay stores, the equipment shed. He said almost nothing to Fannie directly for 6 hours, and she spent those 6 hours alternating between deep respect for his thoroughness and deep irritation at being essentially ignored. That evening he sat across her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looked her in the eye, and told her the truth about her ranch. It was not comfortable. The hay stores were low. 2 of the 4 hands were, in his assessment, competent workers, and the other 2 were essentially stealing their wages. The eastern fence line was going to fail before winter, and when it did, she was going to lose cattle into the Henderson Range. And Cal Henderson was not a man who returned other people's cattle without extracting something for the service. The breeding bulls were aging and needed to be replaced within 2 years, or she would see a sharp decline in calf quality. None of this was what she wanted to hear. All of it was what she needed to. "You're telling me this ranch is in trouble," she said. "I'm telling you it's fixable," Roscoe Barnett said. "Those are different things." She hired him that night. What followed was the most grueling, exhausting, and unexpectedly exhilarating 12 months of Fannie Covington's life. Roscoe was relentless in the best possible way. He dismissed the 2 useless hands within the first week, replaced them with men he had worked with before, both capable and dependable. He renegotiated the hay purchase contract with a supplier in Missoula that cut their winter feed costs by nearly a third. He fixed the eastern fence line himself, working 18-hour days with the hands alongside him until it was done. He set up a grass rotation schedule that Fannie initially argued with loudly, and then watched with growing amazement as it began, over the following months, to show measurable results in the weight of her cattle. They argued constantly. This was perhaps the thing that surprised Fannie most about working with Roscoe Barnett, because she had expected deference. Every man who had ever worked for her father had deferred to him the way water defers to gravity, automatically and without consideration. Roscoe deferred to her about nothing. When he disagreed with her, he said so. When she pushed back, he held his ground with a calm, immovable certainty that initially made her furious and gradually became one of the things she trusted most about him. A man who told you what you wanted to hear was useless. A man who told you the truth because he respected you enough to believe you could handle it was invaluable. The line between invaluable and irreplaceable was thinner than she had realized. She noticed the lamp for the first time in December of 1882, 4 months after Roscoe had come to the Double C. She had ridden into Larkspur Crossing for a meeting with the bank, a meeting she had been dreading for 3 weeks, because the Double C's loan payments were behind, and the banker, a narrow man named Fitch who seemed to experience a quiet pleasure in other people's financial distress, had made it clear that she had very little time to bring the account current. She had presented him with the numbers Roscoe had helped her prepare, the projected revenue from the fall cattle sales, the reduced operating costs, the new contracts. Fitch had studied them with his thin lips pressed together and finally, grudgingly, agreed to extend the note for another 6 months. She had ridden home in the dark, arriving at the Double C late enough that the hands were all long in the bunkhouse. The main house was dark except for one window, the front room window, where a lamp burned with a steady, gentle light. She had assumed at first that she herself had left it burning by accident before she departed that morning. But then she rode into the yard and Roscoe came out of the barn because he had heard her horse on the drive, and he had a curry comb in his hand and the look of a man who had been doing something to keep himself occupied while he waited. "How did it go?" he asked, taking her mare's reins. "Fitch extended the note," she said. Something moved through his face, something that looked like relief so profound it was almost grief. "Good," he said simply. "Did you leave the lamp burning?" she asked. "So you could see the house from the road," he said. "The drive is dark as pitch when there's no moon." It was practical. It was sensible. She told herself it was nothing more than that as she walked into the warm house and stood in the light of the lamp and felt, for the first time since her father died, that the darkness had an edge to it that could be navigated. She went to Billings in February 1883, a trip of 5 days to attend the Regional Cattlemen's Association meeting and speak with a buyer about a spring contract for 60 head. She came home to find the lamp burning in the window. She thought nothing of it. She went to Helena in April for 3 days to deal with a title dispute on the eastern boundary of the Double C's land, a dispute that had its roots in a dark chapter of her father's hidden past, a secret arrangement he had made years before that Fannie had not known existed. She came home in the evening rain to find the lamp burning in the window. She thought about it a little, standing in the rain looking at it. She went to Missoula in June for a week to renegotiate the feed contract herself, wanting to understand the numbers directly, not just be told them secondhand. She came home on a Thursday evening and saw the lamp from the top of the ridge above the valley where the Double C sat, a single warm point of light against the blue dusk, and she stopped her horse on the ridge and looked at it for a long moment before riding down. She was beginning to understand that it was not an accident. She said nothing to Roscoe about it. She did not know how to say it without saying more than she meant to say, or perhaps more than she was ready to say, because to acknowledge the lamp meant acknowledging what it meant that he was leaving it, and what it meant that she was looking for it. She went to Billings again in October, 11 days this time, because the trip involved not just the Cattlemen's Association but a desperate, humiliating set of negotiations with her father's creditors that she had learned about only 3 months prior when a lawyer named Aldridge had arrived at the Double C, with papers revealing that Clement Covington had borrowed money from 3 separate private parties in addition to the bank, using the Double C's land as collateral in ways that were legally murky and practically devastating. This was the dark past she had been forced to confront. Her father, the man she had idolized, had made desperate, secret agreements in the last years of his life, trying to save the ranch from debts she had not known about. Debts that had their origin in a catastrophic cattle loss during the terrible winter of 1879, a winter that had killed a third of his herd and nearly destroyed the operation. He had borrowed from men who did not use lawyers or paperwork in the conventional sense, men who operated with the kind of enforced loyalty that made ordinary banknotes look friendly. One of those men was a Billings businessman named Harlan Price, who was not precisely a criminal, but was very precisely the kind of man who understood that the line between business and coercion was navigable if you had the right leverage. He held a note on 1,200 acres of the Double C's best grassland, the eastern range where the creek ran and the grass grew thick, and he had recently indicated through Aldridge that he was prepared to call that note immediately if Fannie could not produce terms that satisfied him. The 11 days in Billings were among the worst of Fannie's life. She met with Price twice. He was a large, soft-looking man with small eyes and a way of smiling that never reached those eyes, and he made it clear in a dozen subtle and not-so-subtle ways that he had a solution to the problem, a solution that involved Fannie agreeing to sell him the eastern range directly, at a price that was considerably below its actual value. He called this a generous resolution. Fannie called it theft. She said this to his face in the Billings Hotel dining room, quietly and without heat, and watched something sharpen in those small eyes that told her she had made an enemy. She went to the regional land office and spent 2 days going through her father's original deeds and the territorial land records. She found a clerk named Morrison who was young and genuinely helpful, and who helped her identify a legal irregularity in the way Price's note had been recorded that, while not definitive, gave her enough ammunition to return to Price's lawyer with a counterargument that suggested calling the note immediately might result in a legal dispute he was not certain to win. Price's lawyer, who was a good deal more cautious than his employer, advised settling. Price settled grudgingly for a restructured payment schedule that Fannie could actually meet, and that did not require her to sell the Eastern Range. She rode out of Billings on the morning of the 11th day feeling simultaneously victorious and hollowed out, as though she had spent 11 days fighting a battle with her bare hands and had won, but at a cost that had not yet been fully reckoned. She was halfway home, at the top of the ridge above the Double C Valley, when she saw the lamp. And that was the moment the crack opened in her chest and let the truth through, because she had been gone 11 days, 11 nights of darkness. And every one of those nights, if she understood what she was beginning to understand, Roscoe Barnett had walked into the front room of her house and lit that lamp and left it burning so that, when she came home, regardless of the hour, she could see from the road that she had a home to come back to. She sat on her mare in the October dark and breathed through the cracking feeling in her chest and let herself understand for the first time the full weight of what that lamp meant. Then she rode down to the house. He came out of the barn when he heard her on the drive. He was always in the barn when she came home from long trips. She was only now understanding. He was always doing something with his hands, something that gave him a reason to be awake, a reason to be present without making a production of the waiting. She dismounted before he reached her and stood in the yard and looked at him in the lamplight that spilled through the front window. 11 days, she said. He stopped. Something moved behind his eyes. You made good time on the return. Roscoe. Her voice came out differently than she intended. It came out like the truth. How long have you been lighting that lamp? He was quiet for a moment. She watched him weigh the options, the way she had watched him weigh options before when he was deciding how much truth a situation called for. And then he made the choice she had come to expect from him, because Roscoe Barnett, whatever else he was a man who told the truth. Since December, he said. First time you went to Larkspur Crossing at night. Every time, she said. Every time you were away after dark, he said. Yes. The October wind moved through the yard between them, carrying the smell of pine and coming snow and the distant sweetness of dried grass. Why? She said. He looked at her directly, the way he always looked at her, as though her face was a thing worth looking at carefully. Because you should be able to see home from a long way off, he said, especially when the road's been hard. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried at her father's funeral, though she had wanted to. She had not cried in Billings when Price smiled his dead smile at her across the table. She stood in the yard and felt her eyes go hot and pressed her lips together hard against whatever was trying to come out of her. You didn't know I could see it, she said, from the ridge. I hoped you could, he said quietly. Roscoe, she said. And then she stopped, because what she wanted to say was too large and too complicated and too frightening to say in a cold October yard after 11 days on the road. He seemed to understand this. Stepped forward and took her mare's reins the same way he always did, the most natural thing in the world. Delia left supper warming on the stove, he said. Go eat something. He turned toward the barn. She watched his back, the familiar breadth of his shoulders, the way he moved with that particular unhurried certainty that was so purely him it had become, without her noticing, one of the things she oriented herself by. Roscoe, she said again. He stopped. I noticed it, she said. Every time. I want you to know that. I always saw it. He stood with his back to her for a moment. Then he turned, and the lamplight was on his face. And what she saw there was something she recognized because she had seen it before in her own mirror on the mornings after she had spent a sleepless night wondering what it meant that she was starting to look for that lamp. I know, he said. I thought maybe you did. He went into the barn. She stood in the yard looking at the lamp in the window for another long moment, and then she went inside. She ate Delia's supper of beans and cornbread alone at the kitchen table, and thought about the dark past that had shaped her fear of this. The man before Roscoe, the man she had trusted, had been named Gerald Marsh. She had met him in 1880, when she was 23, and he was charming, and the world had felt less complicated than it subsequently proved to be. Gerald had courted her for 8 months with a patience and attentiveness that she had interpreted as love, and that had in fact been strategy. Because Gerald Marsh had debts of his own, and a clear eye for the value of the double C's land, and what marrying Clement Covington's only daughter might mean for a man whose creditors were getting impatient. She had not known this until she discovered, 6 weeks before what would have been their wedding, that Gerald had borrowed money from Cal Henderson using the promise of access to the double C's water rights as collateral, a secret arrangement. A hidden motive so calculated it had taken her breath away when she understood it. She had ended the engagement in a conversation that lasted 3 minutes and had not spoken to Gerald Marsh since. The betrayal had taught her things she had not wanted to know about the gap between appearance and truth, between what people said and what they wanted. It had made her careful. It had made her, if she was honest, a little afraid. Roscoe Barnett was nothing like Gerald Marsh. She knew this in her bones, but knowing something in your bones and trusting it with your heart were 2 different acts requiring 2 different kinds of courage, and Fannie Covington had spent 2 years marshalling the second kind. She finished her supper and washed her plate and went to the front room where the lamp burned. She turned it down but not out, leaving a low glow in the glass, and went to bed. The following morning she was in the barn before sunrise, which was where she always started her days, and Roscoe was already there, which was where he always was. They fell into the morning's work without preamble, which was also how they always did it, because the double C did not wait for anyone to finish being emotionally unsettled before demanding attention. But something had shifted. She felt it in the way the morning moved around them, in the particular quality of the silences that had always been comfortable between them, and were now also charged with something that had not previously been named. She was sorting through the new supply invoices at the barn table when he came to stand at the other end of the table with a mug of coffee and the look of a man who had decided on something. "Fannie," he said. She looked up. "I need to say something plainly," he said, "because I think we've been going around it for a while and I'm not built for going around things." She set down the invoices. "All right," she said. He looked at his coffee mug. Then he looked at her. "I have a great deal of respect for you," he said, "for this ranch, for how you've run it, for what you did in Billings and what you've done all year. But that's not all of it anymore, and I think you know that. And I think I need to be honest about it so you can tell me where we stand, because I don't want to work alongside you every day carrying something that belongs out in the open." The barn was quiet except for the sounds of horses shifting and the morning wind against the boards. "Are you telling me you have feelings for me?" Fannie asked, because she was her father's daughter and her father's daughter did not pretend not to understand plain speech. "Yes," he said, "I am." She stood up from the table. She walked around it slowly, not toward him, just around it because she needed to move. She stood at the barn door and looked out at the October morning, the frost on the grass, the mountains showing their first serious snow on the high ridges. "I've been married once before," she said. "I was supposed to be." "I know," he said. "You told me about Marsh." She turned to look at him. "Did I?" "In June," he said, "when we were fixing the North Pasture Gate and you were talking about why you keep the double C's finances separate from any business partnerships. You told me what he had tried to do." She had forgotten she had told him that. She had been talking about business and the truth had come out sideways, the way truth sometimes did when your hands were busy. "You didn't say anything at the time." "It wasn't the time," he said. "And it wasn't my business." "But now you're making it your business," she said. "I'm making my feelings your information," he said. "What you do with them is your business. It's always your business, Fannie. It's always your choice." She looked at him standing in the barn in the early morning light, holding his coffee mug with both hands, and she understood with absolute clarity that this was not Gerald Marsh. This was not performance or strategy or hidden motive. This was Roscoe Barnett, who had spent 14 months fixing her fences and telling her the truth and lighting a lamp in her window every night she was away, Not to make a statement, not to build towards something, but simply because she should be able to see home from a long way off, especially when the road had been hard. "I have feelings for you too," she said. Something moved through his face, something so unguarded she had to look away from it briefly. "I'm afraid of it," she continued. "I want to tell you that honestly. I'm afraid of what it would mean to trust someone with this much again, with the ranch and with myself." "That's fair," he said. "I won't ask you to not be afraid. I just ask you to let me prove over time that you don't need to be afraid of me." She looked back at him. "How much time?" she said, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "As much as you need," he said, with a quietness that made it the most serious thing she had heard in a long time. "I'm not going anywhere." She picked up her invoices from the table. "I'm going to think about this," she said. "Take all the time you want," he said. She walked out of the barn into the October morning. She stopped 10 paces out and stood looking at the mountains. Behind her she could hear him begin to move, setting his coffee mug down, picking up whatever needed to be done next. The same sounds, the same unhurried certainty. She went back inside the barn. He looked up. "There's a social at the Larkspur Crossing Church Hall on Saturday," she said. "The Harvest Social. I was going to go with Delia and the Hendersons' oldest daughter." "I know," he said. "You mentioned it last week." "I'd like to go with you," she said. "Instead, if you want to." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" "No," she said honestly. "But I think I'd rather be unsure forward than unsure standing still." The corner of his mouth moved. It was, she realized, the first time she had seen him almost smile in 14 months of working alongside him, and it transformed his face in a way that made her feel like she had discovered a room in a house she thought she knew completely. "Saturday," he said. "Yes." She nodded. She went back to her invoices. He went back to his work. The barn was quiet and warm and full of the good smell of horses and hay. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt like a place with a light burning in it. The Harvest Social at Larkspur Crossing's First Methodist Church Hall was the largest gathering of the season in the valley. The kind of event where the whole of the surrounding community pressed itself into a wood-floored hall decorated with dried corn and colored leaves, and assessed each other's situations over pie and fiddle music. Fannie had attended every year since she was a child, first with her father, then in recent years with Delia or alone. She was known in Larkspur Crossing. The Double C was a fixture of the community, and Fannie Covington was, if not exactly well-liked in the effortless way that some people were liked, deeply respected, which she considered the more useful of the two qualities. She wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that her mother had made the year before she passed, altered twice since to accommodate the changes that years of physical work had made to Fannie's frame. She wore her hair up with 2 pins that had been her grandmother's. She looked at herself in the mirror over the washstand and thought, for the first time in a long time, that she looked like a woman who was anticipating something good. Roscoe appeared at the front door at 6 o'clock. He was wearing the dark coat she had seen him wear to church the 2 or 3 times he had attended, with a clean white shirt beneath it. He had shaved with care. He held his hat in his hands, which meant he had taken it off at the door, which meant he was being formal, which was so different from the easy familiarity of every other moment of their acquaintance that it caught her breath briefly. "You look very fine," he said, and the plainness of it, the absolute absence of theatrical flourish, made it more effective than any more elaborate compliment could have been. "So do you," she said. Delia, who had the uncanny ability to materialize in doorways at moments of maximum inconvenience, appeared from the kitchen with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman who has been watching a situation develop for months and has reached the end of her patience with both parties' slowness. "Finally," she said, to no one in particular, and disappeared back into the kitchen. Roscoe caught Fannie's eye. The corner of his mouth did the thing again. She turned so he would not see her actually smile, and went to get her coat. The drive to Larkspur Crossing in the buckboard was 3 miles, and took the better part of 40 minutes on the October road, which was rutted from recent rain and still damp enough to require careful navigation. Roscoe handled the team with the same easy competence he brought to everything physical, and Fannie sat beside him on the bench with the stars appearing above the dark mountains and the night smelling of coming winter. They talked about the ranch, because that was their native language, but it was different from the way they usually talked about it. Less transactional, more like two people who had laid their cards on the table and were discovering that the cards, sorted differently, made a better hand than either had known. He told her about Deer Lodge, where he had grown up, the son of a carpenter father and a schoolteacher mother, neither of whom had survived the decade, both taken by illness within 2 years of each other when he was 18. He had gone to work cattle operations in Colorado first, then gradually north as the Montana range opened up. He had loved the work but not always the men he had worked for, and there had been a long period, he said quietly, when he had believed that the best arrangement for a man of his particular nature was to work well and invest nothing deeper than his labor. "What changed?" Fannie asked. He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "I came to the Double C," he said. She looked at his profile against the night sky. "Because of the work," she said, giving him the easy answer if he wanted it. "At first," he said, "and then not only." She looked forward at the road. "When did you know it was not only about the work?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything without rushing toward an answer. "February," he said, "when you were in Helena for the land dispute. I watched you ride out in the morning, and I spent the whole day in the east pasture working, and I didn't stop once, just kept moving. And I didn't know until that evening when I went to light the lamp that I was doing it because moving was the only thing that made the day manageable." She absorbed this. "February," she said. "That was 9 months ago." "Yes," he said, "and you didn't say anything." "It wasn't my place," he said. "You were dealing with your father's hidden arrangements and the pressure from Price and half a dozen other things that mattered more than my feelings, and I wasn't certain you wanted to hear it." "I did," she said. "Want to hear it. I just didn't know it yet." The lights of Larkspur Crossing appeared ahead, warm rectangles against the dark. The sound of fiddle music carried faintly on the night air. They arrived at the church hall to a reception that was precisely what Fannie had expected, which was to say that half the community noted their arrival together with visible interest and said nothing directly, while the other half said things indirectly and with such determination that it amounted to the same thing. Martha Finch, who was the banker Fitch's wife and ran the church auxiliary committee with the organizational efficiency of a military campaign, greeted them at the door with her eyes moving between them with a calculation that Fannie recognized as rapid social accounting. "Fannie, dear," said Martha Finch. "And Mr. Barnett. How lovely." "Good evening, Martha," Fannie said pleasantly. They moved into the hall. Roscoe was at ease in a way that surprised her slightly, greeting the people he knew from the community with a quiet, solid friendliness that was not performance but genuine, and she watched people respond to it, watched men shake his hand with real respect, and women speak to him with the particular warmth they reserved for men they had assessed as trustworthy. She was seeing him in a new context, and it was adding texture to a picture she had thought was already complete. Tom Alcott, who ran the livery stable in Larkspur Crossing and was one of Fannie's oldest acquaintances, appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of cider and the look of a man who had opinions he was about to share. "Good to see you with someone," he said, which was Tom's version of subtlety. "Thank you, Tom," Fannie said. "Your father would have liked him," Tom said. "Clement always said what the Double C needed was someone who could match you." This was a more complicated thing than Tom probably intended it to be, and Fannie filed it away to think about later. The fiddle music started up properly, a reel that cleared the center of the hall as people moved to the edges or into the dancing space, and Roscoe appeared beside her from wherever he had been speaking with the Alcott's eldest son and held his hand out. "Will you dance?" he asked. "I'm not very good," she said, which was a lie, but she said it because she wanted to see what he did with it. "Neither am I," he said, which she suspected was also a lie. "We'll manage." They managed considerably better than that. He was a confident dancer, not showy but solid, with the same physical certainty he brought to riding and fence work. And after the first awkward 30 seconds of establishing that they were both actually quite capable, they fell into the music with the ease of people who have learned to move around each other in small spaces. She was aware of his hand on the small of her back with an intensity that made the rest of the room somewhat abstract. They danced 3 reels and then stepped outside into the cool night air, because the hall was warm with bodies and wood stove heat, and they stood on the church steps and looked at the dark mountains to the east and breathed cool air. "I'm glad we came," she said. "So am I," he said. "Tom Alcott said my father would have liked you," she said. He looked at her. "Does that matter to you?" "Yes," she said. "It does. Not because I'd make any decision based on it, but because my father was a good judge of men when he wasn't making his own hidden mistakes, and I trust his ghost's opinions as much as I trust his memory." "What do you think he'd have said?" Roscoe asked. She considered the question honestly. "He'd have said you were worth knowing," she said. "He'd have watched you work for about a week, and then he'd have said that. And then he'd have watched me for another few months, and he'd have figured out what was happening before I did, and he would have pretended not to know until I was ready to talk about it." "Sounds like a good man," Roscoe said. "He was," she said. "He was also complicated, and he made bad choices under pressure, and he kept secrets that nearly cost me everything. And I loved him absolutely anyway." She paused. "People are more than their worst moments. I've been learning that." She was aware of what she was saying beneath what she was saying. She thought he was aware of it too. "Fannie," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to court you properly," he said, "if you'll allow it. I'm not going to rush this. I'm not going to push. But I want to be clear about my intentions because I think you deserve that clarity." She looked at him in the church step lamplight, this man who had come to her ranch in a crisis and told her the truth and fixed her fences and lit a lamp in her window every night she was away, and she felt the last of the wall she had been building for 3 years shift slightly, not fall, not all at once, but move. "I'll allow it," she said. He nodded. Something settled in his face, a resolution, a certainty. "Good," he said. "Then let's go back in before Martha Finch comes out here to investigate." She laughed. It came out before she could stop it, genuine and full, and she had not laughed like that in a very long time. He looked at her when she laughed as though he was storing the sound of it somewhere important. They went back inside. The courtship that followed was conducted with the particular character of both of them, which meant it was serious and steady, and involved a great deal of direct conversation alongside the daily work of the ranch, and very occasionally the kind of charged, breathless silence that occurred when they were close to each other, and the air between them became something other than air. He brought her wildflowers in November when there were still a few left in the creek bottom, not a bouquet, just 3 or 4 stems left on the porch rail. She left coffee on the barn table for him on cold mornings, the way she had since he arrived, but now with an awareness that it was also something else. They rode the fence lines together on Saturdays in November, talking about everything, the ranch, the territory, history, what they believed in, what had shaped them. She learned things about him in those November rides that filled out the picture she had been building. He had strong opinions about land rights and the treatment of the Crow and Blackfoot peoples whose territory this had been, and he expressed them with a calm clarity that told her they were not performed opinions, but genuinely held ones. He was not a religious man in a formal sense, but he had what she could only describe as a moral seriousness, a commitment to conducting himself with integrity that was so fundamental to him it did not require an institutional framework. He had been engaged once, years before in Colorado, to a woman named Clara who had found life on a cattle operation too isolated and eventually left for Denver and someone else. He spoke of it without bitterness, with the kind of honest equanimity that she recognized as genuine rather than suppressed. "It was right for her to go," he said simply. "We wanted different things and she knew it before I did." "Did it hurt?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "but not as much as staying in something wrong would have hurt for either of us." She thought about Gerald Marsh. "I know what you mean," she said. They were on the South Ridge in late November when he kissed her for the first time. It was cold enough that their breath showed, and the horses were stamping with impatience to move, and they had been standing looking at the double C from above, visible at this distance as a cluster of buildings with smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney, and she had been saying something about the spring stock plan, and she turned to make a point directly to him, and he was closer than she had realized, or she had moved toward him without registering it, and for a moment they were simply still and looking at each other. He put his hand on her face, very gently, his thumb against her cheekbone. "May I?" he said. "Yes," she said. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was a quiet, careful, entirely certain kiss, the kind that didn't need to prove anything because both people already knew. She felt it all the way through her chest, all the way through the place that had cracked open in October and had been, she now understood, cracking open gradually since December of the previous year, every time she had come home from a hard road to find a light burning in her window. They rode back down in companionable silence, and when they reached the yard, he helped her down from her horse in the way he sometimes did, steadying her arm, but this time his hand lingered a moment after her feet were on the ground, and they stood close in the cold afternoon. "Fannie," he said. "Don't overthink it," she said. "I'm not," he smiled. It was full this time, not the almost smile she had been cataloging for months, but an actual smile, open and warm, and it broke something loose in her that had been held tight for a very long time. "All right," he said. December came with snow, early and serious, the kind of Montana winter that made the mountains disappear behind white curtains and required the full attention of everyone on the Double C just to keep the operation intact. They were busy constantly, checking on cattle, breaking ice on the water troughs, hauling feed, managing the horses through weather that made everything 4 times harder than it was in good conditions. There was no time for long conversations or South Ridge rides, but there did not need to be, because what was between them now had roots deep enough to survive busyness. She caught him watching her sometimes across the yard or the barn, with an expression that was simply open affection, unhidden, and it still surprised her each time because she was not used to being seen with such uncomplicated warmth by anyone. Delia, for her part, behaved as though Fannie and Roscoe's courtship was a matter she had personally arranged and was now overseeing with proprietary satisfaction. She began leaving extra portions at supper and made a point of being conspicuously absent from the kitchen after the evening meal, which Fannie found both obvious and touching. Christmas at the Double C was a modest affair, a tradition since Clement's passing, but this year it was warmer in ways that had nothing to do with the fire and the hearth. Roscoe gave her a hand-tooled leather journal, the kind used for keeping accounts, but the cover had a simple embossed design, a lamp, clean and small in the corner of the cover. She looked at it for a long moment. "So you don't forget to write things down," he said, with deliberate practicality and the corner of his mouth doing its thing. "I know what it means," she said softly. She gave him a good pair of leather work gloves she had ordered specially from the saddler in Missoula, lined with sheepskin, and when he put them on and flexed his hands in them, she watched his face go through something that suggested they were exactly right, and the satisfaction she felt was of a particular, warm variety she had not felt before. New Year came and January passed in the grinding work of deep winter. February brought a thaw that then froze again, coating everything in ice that was beautiful and treacherous, and Roscoe spent 3 days on the eastern range helping pull cattle out of a ditch where they had slid on the ice and been unable to get out alone. He came back exhausted and cold, and she made him sit by the stove with hot coffee while she looked at his hands to make sure he wasn't frostbitten, which was practical, but the way she held his hands to check them was not entirely practical. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, not letting go of his hands yet. He turned his hands over so that he was holding hers instead of her holding his, and they sat by the stove in the kitchen and the February wind threw itself against the window glass, and the lamp on the table burned between them, and Fannie thought that this, right here, was what she had been afraid to want. This exact thing. Not something grand or dramatic or consuming, but something steady and warm and true, like a lamp in a window, like a light you could see from half a mile out when the road had been hard. In March, Harlan Price came to the Double C. She had not expected him. She had believed, since the settlement in October, that their business was concluded, and when his carriage appeared on the drive on a gray Thursday morning, she felt the old cold alertness move through her, the one that had been sharpened by Gerald Marsh and Billings and years of managing threats in men's clothes. Price was the same as he had been, large and soft-looking with small eyes, but there was something additionally wrong about him today, a tension in his jaw, a tightness around those small eyes that told her something had changed in his situation. She met him on the porch. She did not invite him inside. Roscoe was in the barn, and she was aware, without looking, that he had heard the carriage and was watching from the barn doorway with the still alertness of a man who had assessed a situation and positioned himself to be available without inserting himself where he wasn't needed. "Miss Covington," Price said, with his dead smile, "I've come to make you an offer." "We have an agreement, Mr. Price," she said calmly. "The terms of that agreement are being met." "The terms of that agreement," he said, and the dead smile didn't move, "have become somewhat inconvenient to me. I'm prepared to pay you considerably above the assessed value for the Eastern Range. Full purchase, clean transaction. You'd have the capital to retire the bank note entirely." She understood immediately that his financial situation had changed. Something had gone wrong for him somewhere else, and he needed liquid assets. The Eastern Range, with its water rights, was valuable enough to generate significant cash quickly. He was not here to threaten her. He was here because he was desperate, and desperate men made offers. "The Eastern Range is not for sale," she said. "Miss Covington, I'm offering you a fair price." "It's not for sale at any price," she said. "The Eastern Range is the productive heart of this operation. Selling it would save me debt in the short term and destroy the ranch in the long term." "The answer is no." He looked at her with those small eyes, and she could see him calculating, looking for the angle and finding none. She had learned, through the long year of her father's hidden debts and billings and everything that had been forced out into the open, that the best protection against men like Price was not to need them. The Double C was in better shape than it had been in years. The banknote was current. The operation was solvent. "I'll find other means," he said, and it was not quite a threat, but it sat in the air like one. "You do that," she said pleasantly. "Good day, Mr. Price." She watched him get back in his carriage and drive out of the yard. She stood on the porch until the carriage was out of sight, breathing carefully through the aftermath of the old cold alertness. Roscoe came across the yard. He stopped at the porch steps. "Price," he said. "He wanted to buy the Eastern Range," she said. "I said no." "He didn't come here for a social call," Roscoe said. "He came because he needs something. That means his position is weaker than it was." "That's what I thought," she said. "I'm not worried about him." "Should you be?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't think so. He has no more leverage than he had in October, and that wasn't enough then. He'll find another way to solve whatever problem he has." She paused. "But I'm going to write to Aldridge and make sure our paperwork is airtight." "Good," Roscoe said. He looked at her with that particular steadiness. "You handled that well." "I've had practice," she said. He nodded. He started to turn back to the barn. "Roscoe," she said. He turned. "Thank you for being there," she said. Even from the barn, it helped. Something went through his face that she was now fluent in reading. "Always," he said. Spring came to the Double C like a reprieve, green and swift. The creek running high and the grass coming up new and thick on the rotation Roscoe had been managing for nearly 2 years. The cattle were in good health. The hay stores had lasted the winter without crisis. And the books, when Fannie spread them on the kitchen table in late March to do the quarterly accounting, showed the first genuinely comfortable margin the Double C had seen since before her father's crisis year. She sat back in her chair and looked at the numbers and felt something she had almost forgotten. the particular ease of a ranch that was not just surviving but beginning to thrive. She found Roscoe in the south pasture checking the new grass, and she rode to him and showed him the ledger numbers, because there were things you wanted to share with the person who had helped you build them. He looked at the figures for a long moment, then he looked up at the mountains. "Your father would be glad," he said. "He would," she said, "and he'd say it was mostly your doing." "He'd be wrong," Roscoe said. "It's yours, it was always yours. I just helped you get a better look at what you had." This was such a precise articulation of what he had done, and of who he was, that she sat on her horse in the spring sunshine and looked at him and felt the last of the old fear simply dissolve, like ice in the March thaw, quietly and without ceremony. "Roscoe," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. "I want to say that plainly since we both seem to prefer plain speech." He was very still for a moment, the way he went still when something was striking him deeply. Then he looked at her with everything open on his face, everything she had watched him contain and manage with such careful patience for so long. "I love you too," he said. "I have for a long time." "I know," she said. "I think I knew before I knew." He reached up and put his hand over hers where they rested on the saddle horn, and they stayed like that for a moment in the spring morning, with the mountains showing the last of their snow and the creek audible from the south pasture, and the whole of the double sea spread around them in its returning green. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. "I've been waiting for the right time, and I think this might be it." Her heart did something that was not entirely dignified. "Ask," she said. He looked at her with that directness that had never wavered, not once in the 2 years she had known him. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I'm not asking for the ranch or the land or any part of the business arrangement. I'm asking for you. If you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life next to you." She thought about the lamp. She thought about December 1882, when she had come home from Larkspur crossing in the dark to find a warm light in her window, and a man who had put it there, because she should be able to see home from a long way off. She thought about 11 nights in Billings and the ridge above the valley and the crack that had opened in her chest and let the truth through. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He covered her hand with both of his, and the spring morning was brilliant and clear, and the double sea was theirs. They were married in June at the Larkspur Crossing Methodist Church, which was the same church hall where they had danced at the harvest social the previous October. It was a small wedding by the standards of the territory, 30 people, the ranch hands and Delia and Tom Alcott, and a selection of community members who had watched the whole thing develop with the invested interest of people who lived in a place where everyone's life was visible to everyone else. Delia cried throughout the ceremony with an openness that was remarkably at odds with her general demeanor, and that Fannie found unexpectedly moving. Roscoe said his vows with the same directness he brought to everything, looking at Fannie the whole time, not at the minister, as though the words were being spoken to her specifically, which they were. Fannie said hers back to him in the same way. The minister, a young man from Ohio named Reverend Caldwell, who had not been in Larkspur Crossing long enough to have watched the whole story unfold, pronounced them married with what appeared to be genuine emotion, suggesting he had picked up enough of the context to understand that this was not a routine event. They had supper at the church hall, pie and cold chicken and potato salad, and a cake that Delia had made, and that was frankly remarkable given Delia's general approach to sentiment. Tom Alcott made a toast that was mostly about Clement Covington and what he would have said, which made Fannie cry briefly and then recover, which was the correct order of things. They rode home to the double sea in the June evening, married, and the mountains were pink and golden in the sunset, and the valley was full of summer grass, and Fannie felt the world settle around her like something that had been trying to find its arrangement for a long time and had finally succeeded. The summer of 1884 was the finest the double sea had seen in years. The cattle came through in excellent condition, the calf crop was strong, and the new breeding bull that Roscoe had located through a connection in Wyoming, a substantial Hereford with a calm disposition and an impressive genetic background, was already demonstrating the quality improvement that Roscoe had projected when he had first noted, 2 years ago, the need to replace the aging stock. Fannie continued to manage the Double C's business affairs with the same thoroughness she always had, but she was doing it now with a partner who understood the operation as well as she did, and who brought a perspective that complemented hers in ways that consistently made the decisions better than either could have made alone. They disagreed still, fairly regularly, because they were both strong-minded people with genuine convictions, but the disagreements had a different quality now, productive rather than competitive, and they nearly always arrived at conclusions that satisfied both of them. Roscoe formally joined the Double C as a partner in the operation, an arrangement that Fannie had proposed, and that they had spent several weeks working through with careful attention to the legal and practical details, because Fannie was not a woman who did things casually. The arrangement gave Roscoe a genuine stake in the operation's success and put his contribution on the footing it deserved, which was equal partnership with the woman he had helped bring the ranch back from the edge. Harlan Price, as it turned out, encountered serious difficulties with a land scheme in the Yellowstone Valley that summer, difficulties that consumed his attention and resources entirely, and he was never heard from in connection with the Double C again. Fannie received confirmation of this through Aldridge in July and told Roscoe over supper, and they acknowledged it without celebration, because neither of them was given to triumphalism, and because the threat had been managed and was now resolved, and that was all that mattered. Cal Henderson, whose land bordered the Double C on the north, came to pay a formal visit in August, which was unusual enough to put Fannie briefly on alert, because Henderson had a history of opportunistic behavior toward the Double C during vulnerable periods. But he came in daylight with his hat in his hand and the manner of a man who has looked at the current situation and made a practical reassessment. He proposed a water-sharing arrangement that was genuinely mutually beneficial regarding the creek that formed the boundary between the two properties. Roscoe negotiated the specifics with him over 2 visits, and the arrangement they reached was good for both operations. Fannie signed the agreement with the quiet satisfaction of watching years of defensive management shift into something more collaborative. In September, Fannie discovered she was pregnant. She told Roscoe in the evening after supper, when they were sitting on the porch in the September dusk watching the mountains go dark. She had been certain for several days and had spent those days in a complex interior, whether of joy and fear and wonder, and the particular vertigo of understanding that your life is about to expand in ways you cannot fully anticipate. She told him simply, because that was always her way. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the mountains. Then he reached over and took her hand, and she looked at his face in the dusk and saw something she had not seen before, something that was beyond his usual steadiness, something that was simply and completely undone. "Are you all right?" he said, which was what he asked, meaning, "Are you healthy? Is everything well?" "Yes," she said. "I'm well. Everything seems to be as it should be." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and held it there for a moment, and she watched him put himself back together with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything else. "We're going to need to think about the spring work schedule," he said finally, and she laughed because of course that was what he said, because that was who he was, and she loved him completely for it. "We have time," she said. "We have time," he agreed, and his thumb moved against her knuckles back and forth, slow and warm. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was spent in the ordinary, extraordinary work of a ranch and a pregnancy, which is to say, there was never a moment that was not demanding something, and never a moment that was not also, beneath the demand, suffused with a deep and continuing warmth. Delia was beside herself with something that, on a person with a different disposition, would have been called delight. She reorganized the kitchen with reference to future requirements. She produced opinions about names with the frequency and force of weather events. She told Fannie on at least 3 occasions that she had known how this was going to go from the moment Roscoe Barnett arrived with his clean shirt and his 4-sentence letter. And Fannie told her on each occasion that nobody asked her, and Delia treated this response as entirely beside the point. Roscoe was attentive without being hovering, which was the exact right calibration, because Fannie was not a woman who tolerated hovering. He took on additional physical work without making a production of it. He made sure she had warm water in the mornings before she was up. He read to her in the evenings from the newspapers he brought from Larkspur Crossing, because she had always liked being read to, and had told him so in one of their November Ridge conversations, and he had apparently filed it away for when it would be useful. Their son was born in May of 1885, which was, Fannie thought, exactly the right time, because May in the Bitterroot Valley was the peak of green, the month when the world most looked like the promise of itself. Delia served as midwife with impressive competence, and the baby arrived on a Tuesday morning after a labor that was, as Delia put it with characteristic bluntness, adequate in length and not excessive, which Fannie supposed was the most encouraging possible framing. Roscoe was in the kitchen, because that was where Delia had put him, because Delia ran medical events on the Double C with total authority and did not take input from adjacent parties. When the baby's first sounds came through the door, Fannie heard him in the kitchen, heard a sound from him that she had never heard before, a single, exhaled sound that contained more emotion than she had ever heard him express aloud, and she pressed the baby against her and felt the world she had built rearrange itself around a new center. Delia brought him in. He stood in the bedroom doorway looking at Fannie and the baby with an expression she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. "A boy," she said, "come and meet him." He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold the weight of this new person with the same careful, certain steadiness he brought to everything. And she thought that this was who Roscoe Barnett was, someone you could trust with the most fragile and most important things, who would hold them with the same attention he gave to everything that mattered. "Clement," she said, "if you're willing." He looked up at her. Something moved through his face. "Clement," he said. "Yes. Absolutely yes." Clement Barnett arrived in a May that was green and warm, and the Double C received him with all the solidity of a place that had been through the worst and come back to something better. The months that followed were the particular wonderful chaos of new parenthood on an operating cattle ranch, which is to say sleep was scarce, and the baby was demanding, and the cattle required what the cattle required regardless of any human scheduling preferences, and neither Fannie nor Roscoe would have changed a single element of it. They moved through the spring and summer of 1885 in the way of people who are tired, but also anchored in something so fundamental that the tiredness sits differently, less depleting, more earned. Delia, who had declared that she was too old for the chaos of an infant, proved in practice to be constitutionally unable to resist the infant in question. And Clement Barnett spent many mornings in the kitchen in a willow basket, while Delia worked and muttered at him, and he regarded her with the steady dark eyes he had inherited from his father. Fannie went to Helena in August, her first extended trip away from the Double C since Clement's birth, a 2-day matter related to the Territorial Land Office and a water rights documentation issue on the Eastern Range. She was gone 2 nights, the shortest absence she had made in years. She left the baby with Delia and Roscoe, and she rode out of the yard in the August morning feeling the pull of leaving more sharply than she usually did, not with fear, but with the particular keen awareness of a woman who now has multiple things she does not want to be away from. She came home on the second evening along the familiar road, up over the ridge above the Double C Valley, and she saw the lamp burning in the window of the front room. She stopped on the ridge and looked at it as she always did. It was the same lamp, same window, the same warm amber eye against the evening dark. She had 2 nights of absence and he had lit it both nights, because this was simply what he did, because she should be able to see home from a long way off. She sat on her horse on the ridge, and she felt the thing that the lamp had always made her feel, that specific combination of safety and love and the quiet knowledge that someone had thought of her, every night, every time, without fail. She rode down to the house. Roscoe came out of the barn because he heard her horse on the drive, because he always heard her horse on the drive. He was carrying Clement in one arm, which was new and also entirely right-looking, because the baby had apparently been unhappy in the kitchen with Delia and Roscoe had taken him to the barn, and the baby had apparently found this satisfactory. "How did it go?" Roscoe asked, taking her mare's reins with his free hand while Clement regarded her with the composed interest he brought to everything. "The documentation is filed," she said. "The Eastern Range water rights are bulletproof from here forward." "Good," he said. She took Clement from him, and the baby's weight in her arms was the most immediate and complete arrival she had ever known. She kissed the top of his dark head. Roscoe put her mare in the barn. She stood in the yard with the lamplight from the front window on the grass around her, and when Roscoe came back out she looked at him across the yard. "The lamp," she said. He looked at the front window. "Yes," he said, "both nights." She said, "Both nights," he said. She walked across the yard to him. She stopped close enough that he could have reached out and touched her. She looked up at him in the evening light. "I want you to know," she said, "that I have seen it every single time. Every trip, every night I was away, every time I came over that ridge, I always saw it." "I know," he said. He put his hand on her face the same way he had on the South Ridge in November, his thumb on her cheekbone. "I thought about you finding it every time I lit it. You lit it for 2 years before we ever said a word about what it meant," she said. "Yes," he said. "How did you know I'd see it?" she said. "I hoped," he said. "And then after a while I knew. The way you'd sometimes stop on the ridge before you came down, I could see you from the yard." She looked at him. "You watch me stop on the ridge." "Sometimes," he said. "When I was in the yard late, I'd see your figure stop up there against the sky, and I'd know you were looking at the light." She thought about all those moments on both sides of the distance, all those nights with the light between them and the dark around it, both of them aware of the other's awareness, neither of them saying it. "I love you," she said. "I want to keep saying that because I spent a long time not saying things I should have said." "I love you," he said back, simply and completely. "I will keep saying that as many times as you want to hear it." Clement, sandwiched between them, made the sound he made when the world was adequately satisfactory, a soft, content sound that broke the moment into laughter, both of them, simultaneously, the easy, full laughter of two people completely at home in the same life. They went inside. Delia was in the kitchen with supper on the stove, and she looked at Fannie with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman who has presided over the correct outcome of a long and complicated situation. "Sit down," Delia said. "Eat something." They sat down. They ate. The lamp was burning in the front room, and the kitchen was warm, and Clement was on Fannie's knee, investigating the edge of the table, with the intense focus of a person discovering the world. And Roscoe was across the table being exactly who he was. And outside the Montana darkness pressed against the windows, and the mountains were enormous, and the stars above them were countless, and the double sea was theirs, completely and without hidden conditions. In the fall of 1886, Fannie discovered she was pregnant again. She told Roscoe on the porch, as she had before, and he received it as he had before, with that particular undone quality beneath his steadiness. This time she already knew what that quality was and what it meant, and she loved it as she loved all of him, completely and without reservation. "I hope it's a girl," Roscoe said, which surprised her. "Why?" she said. "Because I'd like to see a girl who's like you," he said. "Riding out of here at 26 to negotiate with men twice her age and winning. I'd like to see what that looks like with another generation behind it." She looked at him. "That's the best thing you've ever said to me," she said. "I have years to top it," he said. The pregnancy progressed through the winter, the Double C's third winter with Roscoe at its center, and it was as different from that first terrible year of debt and crisis as anything could be. The operation was stable. The books were solid. The cattle were healthy. The hands, those original two Roscoe had found reliable, and two additional men hired since, were working well, and the Double C was beginning to be spoken of in the valley as one of the stronger operations in the region, which was exactly what Fannie's father had built it to be before the disasters of 1879 had crept up on him. She thought about her father often in this period, in the way you think about the dead who have shaped you, with a mixture of love and complicated understanding. She had been angry at him when the full extent of his secret debts had become clear, a deep and burning anger at the hidden motive of desperation that had nearly cost her everything. That anger had softened over time into something more like sorrow for the man who had been too proud to tell his daughter how bad things had gotten, who had tried to fix it alone and had only made it worse. She understood that kind of pride. She had her own version of it. She took flowers to his grave in the Larkspur Crossing Cemetery on a November day, just her and Clement, who at 1.5 was walking now with the determined, slightly unstable enthusiasm of new mobility. She stood at the grave with Clement holding her hand and told her father silently how things stood, because she had always talked to him and saw no reason to stop just because he was no longer audible. She told him about Roscoe. She told him about the lamp and what it had meant and how long it had taken her to let herself understand it. She told him about Clement, who was pulling on her hand with great purpose because there were rocks nearby that needed investigating. She told him that the Double C was going to be all right, that it was more than all right, that he had built something worth saving and that it had been saved, and that she was grateful for every hard thing he had ever taught her, even when she had not known it was a lesson. The wind moved through the cemetery grass and Clement found a particularly interesting rock, and she stood at her father's grave in the November cold and felt the full strange beauty of being alive in the middle of a life that had almost been something else. She walked home. In March of 1887, their daughter was born on a Thursday afternoon, while a late snowstorm swept across the valley and the horses in the barn stamped, and the cookhouse fire roared and Delia moved through the bedroom with the same complete competence she had brought to Clement's arrival. The baby was small and dark-haired and arrived with an expression of profound concentration, as though she had opinions about the proceedings and was compiling her assessment. Roscoe, in the kitchen again under Delia's orders, was brought in to find Fannie exhausted and the baby awake and alert in a way that newborns frequently were not. "Look at her," Fannie said. He looked. He sat beside her with the same expression as the first time, fully undone, and she watched him put his hand near the baby's face, and the baby turned toward it with instinctive interest. "Clara," Fannie said, "if you'd like." He looked up at her. She watched him understand why she had chosen it. "Are you sure?" he said. "She left and you stayed," Fannie said simply. "And now there's a Clara who gets to be yours. I think that's a good ending to that story." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked back down at Clara Barnett, who was still regarding her father's hand with great seriousness. "Clara," he said. "Yes." The spring of 1887 came in as springs do in Montana, dramatically and with abundant water, the mountains releasing months of snow into the creek systems, the grass coming up in great green rushes across the grazing land. The Double C was busy in the particular way of spring on a cattle operation, all simultaneous demands and insufficient hours, and Fannie and Roscoe moved through it with the efficiency of two people who had been working together long enough to anticipate each other, who knew without discussing it who was going where and why, who understood each other's rhythms and capacities and needs with the intimate knowledge of people who have shared years of daily life. Clement was fascinated by the horses and had to be watched constantly in the barn. Clara, at 2 months old, observed the world from the willow basket in whatever room Delia was working in, and continued to observe it with the compiled assessment expression that seemed to be her natural approach to existence. Tom Alcott came out from Larkspur Crossing in April with a message that Fannie had been named, along with 3 other ranchers in the valley, to a newly formed Territorial Land Use Committee, a recognition of the double C's standing in the region that Fannie accepted with quiet satisfaction. Roscoe told her at supper that her father would have been insufferably proud, and this was the highest compliment available. She went to Helena in May for the first meeting of the committee, 3 days. She left the ranch in Roscoe's hands, which was as natural as breathing, and she rode out of the yard in the May morning with Clement on Roscoe's hip watching her go. She turned in the saddle at the end of the drive and raised her hand. Roscoe raised his. Clement waved with his whole arm, enthusiastically and without precision. She came over the ridge that first evening and looked back at the valley. The lamp was in the window. She was only in Helena for 3 days, 3 nights, but he lit it all 3 nights, and she saw it each time she returned along the evening road. That single warm eye in the window of the house she had been born in and nearly lost and saved and filled with a life she had not known. 2 years ago, she was allowed to want. She stood on the porch on the evening of the 3rd day, having put her horse away and greeted her children and eaten Delia's supper, and she stood in the lamp's light and thought about December 1882, when she had come home from the bank in Larkspur Crossing in the dark and seen it for the first time, and thought she had left it burning by accident. She thought about all the roads she had ridden in and out of the Double C since then. All the times she had crested the ridge or come along the valley road or turned the last corner in the dark and found that point of light telling her she was nearly home. All the times she had arrived in the yard and known, from the lamp and from the sounds of the barn, that he was there. She thought about a love that had announced itself not with grand gestures or eloquent declarations, but with a lamp in a window, lit quietly, night after night, because a woman should be able to see home from a long way off. The simplest possible act, and also, she understood now, the most profound one, because it was sustained, because it was repeated, because it was there every single time without exception or diminishment. Not a grand moment, but a daily one. Not a promise spoken once, but a truth enacted continuously. That was what love was, she thought. Not the peak moments, but the steady ones. Not the declaration, but the lamp, lit again every night she was away, waiting for her to come home. Roscoe appeared at the porch door behind her. Coming in, he said. In a minute, she said. Look at the lamp. He came to stand beside her. He looked at the front window, at the lamp burning in it, which was somewhat unusual since they were both inside and she had just returned. I lit it before you got back, he said. Force of habit. She looked at him. Don't break it, she said. He looked at her with the quietness that was most completely him, that bedrock steadiness beneath which she could now read everything, the depth of what he felt, the certainty of it, the absolute permanence of his presence in her life. I won't, he said. I never planned to. She took his hand. They stood on the porch in the May evening, and the mountains were dark and enormous against the last light of the sky, and the valley was full of spring. And from inside the house came the sounds of Delia and the children, the ordinary beautiful sounds of a full life. And the lamp burned in the window the way it had burned every night she was away, every night for years, casting its warm, steady light out into the dark so that she could always find her way home. The Double C stood solid on its 4,000 acres, the grass thick on the eastern range where the creek ran, the cattle moving in the dusk, the barn warm with horses, the house warm with people who loved each other without hidden conditions or secret motives or forced choices or anything other than the honest, ordinary, extraordinary truth of 2 people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and were still choosing each other every day. Fannie Covington Barnett stood on the porch of the house her father had built, holding the hand of the man she had been afraid to love and had loved anyway, looking at the lamp in the window, and she thought, this is it. This is the whole thing. This is what you come home to, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The lamp burned on.